Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here today. My name is Rana, and I'm a PhD student here at SOAS in the law department. I am also a GTA and a policy research assistant with ICOP, the Influencing Corridors of Power project. We're honored with an esteemed panel of experts who will speak to us on crucial debate on global arms trade around the world, but also here in the UK and its far-reaching implications. Today's event is chaired by our very own Zahraa Kapasi. Zahraa Kapasi is a consultant for scrap weapons, where she focuses on youth engagement and strategic outreach, with a particular interest in cultural diplomacy, interfaith dialogue on disarmament, and archival research. She's also a researcher on the United Nations War Crimes Commission and associate tutor at SOAS. Thank you all for being here, and Zahraa, you can begin.
Thank you very much. Welcome to today's event, Dealing Disruption, the Global Arms Trade in Gaza, hosted by ICOP. So today, to discuss how the global arms trade impacts the war on Gaza and conflict worldwide, we are joined by Charlotte Andrews Briscoe, who is a lawyer at Global Legal Action Network, Andrew Feinstein, Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations, Jinsella, co-founder and executive director of Demilitarise Education, and Ousman Noor, who is joining us online, who is the co-founder of the Civilian Agenda. So today we will be delving into the ramifications of the arms trade, probing into its role in the ongoing war on Gaza, whilst also shining a spotlight on the investments of UK universities in the arms trade, raising ethical questions about complicity and accountability in the pursuit of profit. The discussion will also examine the issue of whether the UK is violating international law by supplying arms to Israel during the conflict. And finally, we'll be hearing about artificial intelligence warfare and the role of NGOs campaigning to end the proliferation of lethal autonomous weapons. So after each speaker, the panelists will have an opportunity to respond. After the panel discussion, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. So please do hold on to your questions. So Andrew Feinstein is the Executive Director of Shadow World Investigation, which undertakes investigations into cases of grand corruption, corporate malfeasance, and militarism, predominantly in the global arms trade. He was a former African National Congress member of Parliament in South Africa for 7 years, before resigning in protest at the ANC's refusal to allow an independent and comprehensive inquiry into a multi-million-dollar arms deal. Andrew has also written 2 books on the illicit global arms trade called The Shadow World and After the Party. Thank you.
First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. It really is great to be here with such an amazing panel. It was also lovely to walk through the encampment to get here and just reminded us why we're having this session and how important it is. And similarly, how important the work of Glenn is. And Charlotte, I must say, that was one of the most concise and devastating legal summaries I've ever heard. And I sort of felt as you were speaking 2 things. One is I didn't need to say anything after that. But the second is that I will for only one reason. And that's because I'm not a lawyer and I don't have to choose my words carefully. Because I think it's extremely important for us to understand that what is happening in Gaza is not just a human tragedy of indescribable proportions. It has created a huge crisis for our democracies in what we often describe as the Western world. And I think in your few minutes, you gave such a great analysis of exactly why that is the case. And I thought what I'd do is talk very briefly about some of the similarities and parallels between the South African apartheid situation and what we experienced in Israel today in relation to arms. And then speak for a moment about my experience as an investigative writer of the British arms export control system and the British legal system and judiciary. So the first thing to say is that we should bear in mind that for many of the later years of the apartheid South African state, there was the UN arms embargo in place. It was an arms embargo that countries, including the United Kingdom, supported. One of the people who made most money from violating that embargo was a man called Dennis Thatcher, who happened to be the husband of the Prime Minister who had voted for that embargo in the United Nations. He made tens of millions of pounds out of breaking the arms and oil embargoes against apartheid South Africa. And this was not the only instance in which Margaret Thatcher's government voted for arms embargoes and then took great pleasure in profiting from violating them. Sierra Leone was the other obvious example that springs to mind. There's a brilliant book written by a colleague of ours in South Africa, Henny van Vuuren, called Apartheid, Guns and Money. And to understand the extent of complicity with the apartheid state by the United Kingdom, the US, and most Western European governments, that book is an essential read. But, and this is a really important difference as we consider these issues, amongst the vast majority of citizens of the world, there was such a profound distaste for the apartheid regime that even Mrs. Thatcher, who was telling the South African government privately that they should kill Nelson Mandela in jail because it was too dangerous to keep him alive, even Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan could not publicly support the system of apartheid in South Africa. Politics and public opinion determined that they had to pretend that they were not providing massive covert support to the regime. And they spoke about this policy of constructive engagement with the regime in order to change the system of racism, thereby accepting that the system of racism was itself fundamentally and profoundly wrong. In the case of Israel, we have a situation in the United Kingdom and most countries of the West where over 70% of people have wanted an immediate and unconditional ceasefire for around 7 months. And our governments have not only been unstinting in their political and diplomatic support for the state of Israel, they have refused to criticize it, as have almost all mainstream politicians in this country and most Western countries, including my own constituency MP, and we're sitting in his constituency now, Keir Starmer, who is supposed to be the leader of a democratic socialist party. Of course, it is neither democratic nor socialist. So it is astonishing to me that a state that, according to the Rome Statute, has been practicing apartheid since 1948. Interestingly, the same point at which real Nazis took control of the South African state after the Second World War and created a system of legalized, legislated apartheid. The state of Israel, which has also been overseeing brutally and illegally an apartheid state, is nevertheless given the sort of public support that it is. The sense of déjà vu that I have had over the past awful 7.5 months, as we've heard the most senior politicians and officials of Israel demonize the United Nations and the international rule of law. And I say this as the son of a Holocaust survivor who lost dozens of her family in Auschwitz, that to see the Israeli ambassador appear before the UN trying to defend his country's genocidal actions while wearing the exact same yellow Star of David that my mother had to wear in Nazi-occupied Vienna was one of the most repellent and repulsive abuses of the memory of the millions who were slaughtered by the Nazis that I've ever experienced. And to hear the way in which Israel demonizes the international rule of law, which was set in place primarily to ensure that what happened during the Holocaust never occurs again, is particularly difficult to have to listen to, because what I was taught by my mother was that never again is for all humanity, not just for Jews. I believe that what both the conflict in Yemen, what we are calling in a book that my colleagues and I who are here are writing at the moment on the conflicts in Yemen and Gaza, these two conflicts, in my opinion, and again to say I'm not a lawyer, mark the end of the international rule of law. And it is our governments who are responsible for the destruction of that edifice. But I also believe that by continuing to sell weapons to Israel, and I would argue, for a number of similar, but also a few slightly different reasons. We have seen this in the case of the sale of weaponry to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates in relation to the Yemeni conflict. This is being done by our government, facilitated by the judiciary, in violation of British law. We hear ministers in this country, as a matter of rote, it's like somebody has pressed a button whenever they are questioned about arms exports to these regimes. They extol the virtues of, perhaps if they describe it, the most rigorous arms export controls in the world. Now, the mendacity of our political class is so profound that today I think there are very few who take that seriously. But for many years, there were many, many British citizens. And we should remember that these arms exports are undertaken in our names as citizens and with our tax funds, because BAE Systems, Kinetic, Rolls-Royce, etc., would not be in business if it wasn't for the massive subsidies that they receive from our tax funds. One of our colleagues at Shadowwood Investigations, Professor Anastasia, argues that in reality, and she is probably the foremost expert on arms export controls, in reality, in practice, Britain probably has one of the weakest and worst systems in the world. And that's saying something. Because as Amnesty International have been saying for decades, both before and after the International Arms Trade Treaty, which we haven't even mentioned, trade in weapons is less regulated than the global trade in bananas. Now, I don't need to cover the legal ground that Charlotte has so agreed. The cognitive dissonance of our ministers and their senior officials to be able to claim, even in terms of this incredibly low bar that they've established for arms export controls, the cognitive dissonance required to be able to argue that these weapons are not severely increasing the risk of civilian harm is barely comprehensible. I have noticed, and I wish I could say that this was a uniquely British problem, but I've noticed this in a number of jurisdictions around the world, that the courts, when it comes to issues of national security, seem to effectively abrogate their responsibilities and their powers. The extent to which they provide executive prerogative to the executive arm of government is terrifying, because what could be more important for a government that is supposed to be representative of its people than decisions about exporting the means to murder other human beings into conflict? So I believe that the courts are failing us too. And thank goodness for lawyers like Lamb and others who attempt still to take these cases to point out this failure of our judicial system. It's also important to add that we have no oversight in our democratic system in this country of our arms exports. There was a committee in Parliament for many years called laughably the Committees on Arms Export Controls, because it was constituted of a number of standing committees. It had absolutely no standing status or power. I gave evidence before that committee a few times before I realized it was a total waste of their time and my time. They had absolutely no intention of providing any oversight, to the extent that for a period of almost 3 years, the committee didn't meet. Why? Because they couldn't agree on what they could and couldn't discuss. And when they started to meet again, it was only with the agreement that they would not discuss British arms exports to Saudi Arabia, which at that time was the single biggest recipient of British weapons and was violating international humanitarian law, amongst other things, in its role in the conflict in Yemen. Even when it did bother to produce a report, which were frankly derisory, the executive arm of government ignored it. The functions have now been moved. The Cape no longer exists. We should celebrate that. However, its functions have now moved to the committee that deals with business and trade. The conflicts of interests of the members of that committee dealing with business and trade are legend. To think that those individuals are going to in any way exercise meaningful oversight of British arms export is unfortunately a false and vain hope. Let me say finally that if you haven't seen it, I would strongly recommend that you watch on the declassified UK site a film called Wharton's War on Yemen, in which a very senior former Foreign and Commonwealth Office lawyer bursts into tears when she describes her experience of trying to describe to the then foreign minister, one Boris Johnson, the impact that British weapons was having on innocent civilians in Yemen. The minister giggled through her greeting. This is the same minister who went on to become prime minister. I have no doubt that the way in which arms export controls operate in the United Kingdom undermine our democracy and the rule of law. Why does this even happen? It's a combination of geopolitics and corruption, which I'm very happy to discuss further in the Q&A. Corruption, for which the arms trade is responsible for 40% of all corruption in all global trade, with a significant amount of those bribes finding their way to our main political parties and to our most senior individual politicians once they leave office. These bribes effectively oil the wheels of Western democracies, which are, I'm afraid, in the words of Greg Palast, the American journalist, the very best democracies that money can buy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. That was quite a profound intervention. I think you've given everyone a lot to think about. I did want to touch on, you mentioned the weaknesses of the arms trade treaty, while also highlighting the level of corruption involved in the arms trade and the crumbling faith in international law. How do we come back from that? What steps can be taken to reinstate restrictions on the flow of arms and development?
I believe, and I hope this doesn't cut across too much of the debate that we're going to have in the discussion, but I believe that we have to look for change in these sorts of areas in two linked and parallel ways. On the one hand, we have to challenge the system, as Glan and others are doing, as many activists campaign against arms trade, Amnesty, Oxfam, and many others try to do, by engaging with our very sclerotic political system and legal system. And we have to do that. We can't sit by idly while today another 200 to 300 people are being slaughtered. And tomorrow we know the same again is going to happen. But at the same time, unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion, which people might or might not agree with, that the only way we are going to see a fundamental change in the nature and functioning of the global arms trade is with quite profound change to our structured political systems. And I think a lot of the problems with the arms trade are a reflection of exactly the problems with our political system. And the very people we are expecting better regulate and control the arms trade are the very people who are benefiting from it, both materially and politically. So I think it's in those two parallel ways. So we have to engage politically, and we have to look at profound political change, but we cannot ignore the feeling.
Thank you very much. Jinsella and Charlotte, want to add anything or respond?
No, I totally agree with lots of that, but I imagine there'll be
Okay, we will then hear from Jinsella. Jinsella is the co-founder and executive director of Demilitarise Education, hosting the world's first universities and arms database and a model for comprehensive demilitarization. Her work has led to the uncovering of over £1.9 billion of UK university partnerships with the arms trade. Jinsella has also worked as executive producer for Don't Buy a Bomb, the film that was mentioned previously, a new documentary telling the story of how campaigners took the UK government to court for illegal arms sales to Saudi Arabia. Thank you, Jinsella.
Thank you. Other co-founder over here. Yeah, it's really, really amazing to follow such incredible speakers with so much like macro context, which brings us back into the university space perfectly. And I just want to say thank you to Alison and Sanjana for organising this team, because your like method of bringing the expertise that is the academic world and the truth into policies needs extra help, you know. It needs to be channeled in, and it's not happening right now. Yeah, demilitarise education. So we all know about the military-industrial complex, and that term was coined by Eisenhower in his departure speech. And then 6 years later, it was William Fulbright, which coined the military-industrial academic complex. And that's often missed. And what like mine, Mel's and the education team's work has really brought us a lot closer to is understanding not just how the academic aspect of it has huge economic leverage, but also how it feeds into the consciousness of our society. The education system by itself was designed to create obedient workforce and people willing to join the military. when we then are faced with times like today, where we're looking at genocide in different parts of the world and crises, and we're in a British pub and wondering why people are saying, oh, it's just the way the world is, or, oh, there's nothing I can do about it. That is paid for. That is strategic implementation from our education system. And Forces Watch's research has found that over £90 million, at least since 2012, has been spent promoting military ethos in primary and secondary schools. Military ethos is the need to aggressively defend one's own interests and be prepared to use force to do so. It's really, really crazy. And when you're thinking about it from a young age, primary school through secondary school, we can consider it as a bit of a hope vacuum. People getting sucked in, believing that they can't actually change that. And then when we get to the university space, we're really then looking at how people are being used as tools for the future labour market. The academic space is really being manipulated by market forces like the political system is. And it's really devastating in the concept of what education is for. It should, we can all agree, and probably on SOAS's policy or whatever, somewhere, but oh, we want to better the world and we want to make sustainable opportunities and discover stuff, right? And then, of course, and this is largely due to Thatcher era as well, when there was mass privatisation of research centres, which led a shift around like the space in which researchers have. There was a statement they put out that universities have become overfunded and too academic, and they must better align to industry. And that's really what happened. And there is then a lot more opportunity for arms companies with more back in their pocket to dominate those spaces, and yeah, use our great knowledge centres and educational capacity to pursue their military agenda. Now, our research, as Zahraa said, has uncovered nearly £2 billion worth of UK university partnerships with the arms trade. And that £2 billion is made up of 3 partnership types that we track. The first one is financial. So this is when money is actually leaving the university to buy shares and going through investment portfolios and then profiting from arms companies. And the other 2 are research and academic. So this is when money is coming into the university. In the research section, it's for either department, faculty, or sometimes individual people. They will get sponsored to build arms-oriented research. And then the academic is the one which is considered more present on campus, because this is when an arms company will pay a university, usually the top tier, because the careers fair, there's tiers which companies can buy out to have spaces in the careers fairs. So yeah, that's the academic partnership covers the careers funneling. It covers consultancy. So an arms company will actually say, I want to know more about what you're doing here, to then, of course, take back to their own agenda. At SOAS, we have, and by the way, congratulations on everyone for getting that ceasefire statement. That really is huge. Like, well done, everybody. Like, not happening in many places, Glasgow and Portsmouth as well. It's really, really difficult to get, and yeah, it's what we found at SOAS, because there is less research and academia that we found through our data collection, but they have from 2018 to 2022 a project which was training the Ministry of Defence in cultural programs. Yeah. And we have case studies just like this on campuses all across the country, evidencing how much university space and education is being used to advance the military political agenda. So I want to just kind of bring that in relation to the encampment, and what's happening now and what we've learned. And I'll do that through the structure of the Demilitarised Education Treaty, which we are advocating to see adopted across UK campuses. The treaty is a comprehensive plan for demilitarisation, which starts with transparency and disclosure of investments, which is great to see on the encampment demands. Then policy change, and that is to exclude arms partnerships from all three of those partnership types: financial, active, and research. Then we have a divestment process, and then a reinvestment process, because we want to see education and capacity used to advance peace and achieve peace. Now, what we've been learning while talking to different student encampments and different staff groups as well is really how scarce the opportunity is to talk to administration and those policy creators within the university space. And often they use very similar tactics to what you guys have both in delays and good like linguistic barriers where they're trying to trip inexperienced campaigns up and bring out cards which you've not thought about, but kind of display your argument. And therefore, we've been really helping students to come together and be very, go into those meeting spaces with very, very specific demands, like simple stuff like, when are you next going to be reviewing this policy? Like, what part of this policy have you not considered in terms of this? And making sure that that hour, which, you know, probably half an hour will be buffering, filling, like you don't have very much time at all. So you do leave those very scarce meetings with something to then build on the next. And I just want to make everyone aware that our treaty is a really good structure for you to be able to do that in your own time. And also know that we are, you know, talking to a lot of the groups. So this is some way that we can build national continuity between our university demands. So, all that being said, the student movement is so strong right now. And I think this collapse in global governance, as Andrew described, is really bubbling in the university space. And it must be tracked. And if anyone is part of these campaigns, please write down timelines of what's happening, the way the security is interacting with you, archive it. And also, we need to also look beyond. The demilitarization process is essential to be able to derail the arms trade and see our university just put to economic transformation. And that's where I think what we're doing is really hopeful. It brings a lot of excitement to people, because not only is it about the demilitarization, it's about opening up that space to the economic and political transformation we need and desire. And in the same way that institutions and industry have been called in to meet wartime needs, we now need policy and our capacity to be pulled into the economic transformation. And I really see universities at the heart of being able to achieve that, pulling all the great minds, all the great research, technological infrastructure that, you know, thousands of academics at their fingertips to that agenda is extremely positive and possible through the reharnessing of these educational spaces. So yeah, big ups to everyone working to get arms companies out of the education space and come to us if you want to just be reaffirmed of how that is, because I honestly believe that education is the architecture of our society. And while our arms is in the war agenda, is infiltrated in it, there is no realistic hope for peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jinsella. It's inspiring how you're empowering students to hold institutions to account and actually give them a voice to speak out and have a say in what is going on. A personal question, sorry. What made you both start the database and start your organization? What was the inspiration?
Anger. We'll start there. Because I went to the Dicey Arms Fair, finding out that London hosts one of the world's biggest arms fairs every other year. I was like, wait a second, I'm trying to be in like eco fashion, and you're selling weapons to to war criminals. What's going on here? Like, you know? So yeah, understanding that level of corruption and how much of a delusion British foreign policy is, and then also experiencing firsthand how much struggle there is in the student movement, because we've been doing this work for decades, but when students graduate, it all gets lost. And that takes the students back to the start again. And so much inefficiency occurs, and I hate inefficiency. So I experienced the need for a database, and we built it.
Thank you very much. Would anyone in the panel like to add anything? No? Okay. We will now move on to Ousman Noor. He is the Director of the Civilian Agenda, which amplifies civilian voices in armed conflict. He worked as a human rights director in London for 9 years, specializing in refugee and detention law, and taught as a senior teaching fellow at SOAS. For over 3 years, Ousman was the government relations manager at Stop Killer Robots, a coalition of more than 250 NGOs from over 70 countries. Following a personal tweet calling for an end to occupation, apartheid, and ethnic cleansing in Palestine, his employment was terminated. So over to Ousman.
Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor to be back at SOAS in a virtual way. I did study there and taught there too. I'm going to speak quite bluntly, speak from the heart, and I hope you'll forgive me if what I'm going to say is radical. That's SOAS, I think you're used to hearing radical messages and taking radical causes. So I used to work as a human rights barrister in London. I focused on refugees. And then I moved to Geneva and was working in disarmament. I was working for the Stop Killer Robots campaign. And Zahraa, I think you already mentioned that was a coalition of civil society organizations advocating for a new treaty on autonomous weapon systems, so systems that use artificial intelligence to kill people. So my job was to lobby diplomats around the United Nations space, attend United Nations meetings on this topic, do bilateral discussions, attend international conferences, and built up a kind of portfolio of diplomatic contacts. And my role was just to slowly advocate in favor of this new treaty. So obviously an important issue, especially as we see that these weapons are the systems that are being used for genocide right now by Israel in Gaza. You may have already heard about the autonomous selection processes using artificial intelligence that Israel is deploying, such as the Lavender and Gospel systems that was reported by 972 and Local Call magazines. And we were a large coalition of civil society organizations advocating for the last 10 years against that. I was sent to the New York General Assembly in October 2023, I guess 7 months ago, because we had a resolution that we were advocating in favor of, and we were quite excited about that resolution. It was the first resolution in the UNGA dealing with that issue, and I had been lobbying all year in Geneva in favor of this resolution. And I was sent there from the 7th to the 14th of October because the vote was going to be happening at the end of October. So as you all know, that's when the violence erupted in Israel and Palestine. And I landed in New York. Zahraa, you were there. I remember, because we had dinner together. It's such a funny coincidence that you're hosting this. So you remember when we got there, there were Israeli protesters everywhere. There was a sense of foreboding about what was going to happen. I think many of us knew that the response from Israel was going to be catastrophic. Anyone who knows about the history of that region knows that Israel's response was going to be brutal. It was, I think Andrew used this phrase, cognitive dissonance. That's exactly how we all felt, because the colleagues that I had built throughout the last 3 years were people working in peace and disarmament in different states, European states, Latin American states, and ostensibly they were concerned about international humanitarian law, human rights law, ethics, dignity. And I had been, lobbying them on these bases for our treaty. But what you discover in these times is that all of that goes out the window when something like this happens, and there's a total cowardice amongst those very people who are there to speak out in favor of international humanitarian law because of power, because of politics, because those who they serve are the ones doing the damage. So I'm there with all of these colleagues thinking, what are we going to do in this situation? We are attending the meetings in the UNGA Disarmament and International Security Chamber. We were in the room when the Israeli ambassador called the Palestinians barbarians and savages and started drumming up for what was obviously going to be, at the very least, a very horrific, violent ethnic cleansing. And I'm looking in the eyes of my colleagues when he's saying these things and thinking, are you going to let him get away with this? Of course you are. And is this cognitive dissonance? So civil society, we are there to speak out, right? That's our role. We're there to, we're the ones that are going to hold them to account. That's what we're mandated to do. That's what our vision and values tell us that we should do. That's how many of us get funding, is saying that we speak out against oppression. We speak out for those who are victims or going to be victims of war. And so I reached out to my boss and said, we should say something at the very least. If, our friends in the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs aren't going to, if our colleagues in the French Ministry of Defense are not going to say anything, surely that's our role. We should say, let's not do any ethnic cleansing. Let's advocate at the very least for a humanitarian corridor, because you remember that was one of the concerns. There was still nowhere for the people of Gaza to go when the indiscriminate bombing began. So on the 13th of October, Benjamin Netanyahu had announced that he was going to turn Gaza into a wasteland. They had already cut off the food, the water, the gas, the electricity, and the indiscriminate bombing had begun. Zahraa, that's when I went, I think we had dinner, right? I think the next morning, I reached out to my boss and said, let's use our own campaign network to advocate for a humanitarian corridor. That's the very least, bottom rung sort of request here. We're not challenging Israel, but let's at least ask for a humanitarian corridor. And I was told to shut up. I was told, don't email our own coalition of civil society organizations on this topic. And I pleaded with my boss, and frankly, I was in tears. I was in tears all day, actually, because I knew what was about to happen. I'm not from Palestine. I'm from Kashmir. We know what colonization looks like, and we know what that dehumanization feels like. So, and I'd worked as a human rights barrister representing people from many countries of conflict, and I know what it feels like when you're ignored and you're treated in that way. So I was tearful, actually, and I reached out to my boss and said, let's do this, and I was told to shut up, basically. Long story short, I did a tweet. I tweeted from my personal account from outside the United Nations. I just made a video and said, We are witnessing ethnic cleansing. I actually invoked the memory of visiting the Imperial War Museum in London. When I used to practice as a barrister, I visited the Imperial War Museum. I went to the Holocaust Memorial that they have there, and remember seeing this journey where you go through the museum and you see how dehumanization begins, and you see the horrific scenes of the Holocaust, and the leftover shoes and the leftover clothes of those who had been killed in gas chambers. And there's a sign on the wall as you leave that says, all it takes for evil to thrive is for good people to do nothing. And I remember when I went there and I said, if this ever happens, you know, I would definitely say something. So I did. I made a tweet and I sent it to friends and family, and some of these colleagues who I had been working on for peace and security and international humanitarian law. Word got around that I'd sent this tweet, and I was immediately suspended from the campaign. I had no previous disciplinary actions. I was well liked. I had no complaints about me. In fact, I think I was doing a really good job. This resolution was a huge success. I take some credit for that, given that I basically lobbied about 100 states to get them to vote yes on it. But I was immediately suspended. And the reason was given because of your personal communication on a sensitive political issue. So I sent an email out to the leadership of the campaign. This is Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Women's International League of Peace and Freedom, some of the biggest NGOs in the world, and said, you know, I'm really shocked that I'm being suspended. This is what happened. I was in tears on this day. All I wanted to do was sort of speak out. And I described how terrible it felt that I had been suspended. Our own employment law manual, employment handbook, sorry, of the campaign says that if you're going to have a disciplinary action, you know, there has to be a series of writings that they do, 3 warnings, then a disciplinary hearing. None of that happened. I was immediately dismissed from the campaign. I was dismissed with no ceremony. My profile was immediately deleted from the campaign website. My email access was terminated. My UN grounds pass was revoked. And my boss sent an email out to everyone, hundreds of people, diplomats, saying, Ousman has left the campaign and we wish him well. That was the end of it. Fast forward a few months, this is now an unlawful dismissal claim in Geneva, me saying that this is a breach of my right to freedom of speech, and this is guaranteed by the Swiss constitution, and that is a legitimate basis for claiming unlawful dismissal. But it's been a long saga, as you can imagine, getting to that point. Why has this happened and what has it taught me? The whole system is rotten. It's all a facade. I was listening carefully to Charlotte, how the judiciary is a facade. And I'm not undermining at all or denigrating at all the work, the excellent and important work that you're doing for accountability, but are we not seeing how much the judiciary is a facade in these circumstances? The United Nations is a facade. The Security Council is a facade. Civil society is a facade. It's all connected to a system that is rotten to the core, that is allowing oppression, war crimes to perpetuate and giving us a false illusion that these systems are going to do something about it. They're not. We've been witnessing the genocide going on for 7 months. We've seen the most barbaric, cruel, heartless, you know, similar to how I felt when I visited the Holocaust Memorial Museum, that same level of brutality. And we've been watching it on our TV for 7 months, and none of these institutions are stopping it. And so, you know, we've been saying this, we've become aware of this. I think we now need to get to the point where we just accept that these institutions are all a facade, and we now need to mobilize to do something about that. And actually, so I'm now in Amman. I left Geneva. I'm fed up of Geneva. I couldn't stand going to the United Nations anymore. You have all these people who, you know, as people are watching what's going on, and probably if they're humans, I think that they are humans, are feeling terrible about it, but they just carry on with their job, carry on going and making statements, saying Hamas, 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 not stopping the violence that we keep seeing. They carry on doing their job, and we just carry on doing this. So I've moved to Amman. I moved here a week ago, and I moved with my wife, who is Palestinian, and I am now in full-fledged activist mode. Last week, I spontaneously made a call on my TikTok. I got TikTok recently, for a global strike on Friday. And I was actually amazed to see how tens of millions of people watched that video. And I think tens of thousands of people actually did the strike. The strike was to not work, to not buy any goods or services, and don't do any banking transactions. And I was getting messages from people all over the world saying, we're going to do it, we're going to do it. And I think that speaks to the mood people are in. We are totally beyond angry at the impotence of our institutions to prevent genocide, which is their moral, political, and legal obligation, and they're failing to do that. And so what do we have available to us? What tools do we have? Well, we're not going to go and fight, but what we can do is unplug ourselves from this system that perpetuates this misery. And we all have some agency, we all have power. Individually, perhaps not much, but if we can mobilize, create a framework in which we take collective action and resist collectively, I think we can make an impact. I think it was really telling that when the Houthis started disrupting global trade, that's when, you know, some of the powers started to get worried. We got to hit them where it hurts. It's a global economic system. So actually, I repeated the call for a strike to take place this Friday, and this time I'm doing more for it. I actually made a call on, again, TikTok. TikTok's the one, by the way, guys. It's filled with very young, energetic people. And it doesn't surprise me that it's young people who are actually feeling like we can change things, because it seems to me, and my observation from life, the older we get, perhaps the more disillusioned we become, and the less we believe that we have the power to change things. So I made another call and I said, send me videos of you wearing red, rise for Rafah, red for Rafah, a red line has been crossed, and we're going to strike on Friday. And I'm starting to get dozens of videos coming in, and I'm going to make a compilation and get that out tomorrow. And I'm going to keep on pushing and getting everyone who's participated in this strike to keep on pushing to do this every Friday, and let the world know that you might tolerate this, though, you political leaders who are totally complicit in this genocide, but we're not. You've crossed our red line, and we're going to mobilize until we get that change. Andrew, you said that we need total political change. That's only going to happen through revolution. And that's what we need. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ousman, and thank you for taking a stand. In our field of work, it doesn't work to pick and choose who peace applies to. Peace does not work if it doesn't help everyone. So thank you very much for that. Were there any reflections or comments that anyone from the panel wanted to share before we move on to questions? Let's bring on the revolution.
Check it out, guys. SOAS students, if you're listening. SOAS was what created my activism. You know, I went there and I was energized by being at SOAS. I think you guys should join this strike. It's a very new thing, but I think if we do it every Friday and make it, you know, we need people who are good on social media, who are able to get the message out, who are good at talking to the your mainstream media. Go on my Twitter and see what I'm asking for, because it's actually drawing millions of people already. And I think right now is the time, you know, if not now, then when? So help out and get involved.
Thank you very much. I would now like to We turn around, sorry. I would now like to open the floor to any questions. We can take a couple at a time, and if you have a question, you can raise a hand, stand up.
Thanks so much. That was really incredible. I have a question. I'll throw it out generally, but it's specific to our efforts. So I'm a faculty at the University of Edinburgh, and we are in negotiation with administration now, who have their ear after pressing faculty and students in the area. And we're in a conversation around what the university's invested in. And there's a conversation around what is a conventional versus controversial weapon. And we're trying to push the link that companies like Google and Amazon through Project Nimbus, which are building the infrastructure for AI for Israel's military and its state, are providing components for controversial weapons and AI as controversial weapons because AI is newer than nuclear or chemical or cluster munitions. We're struggling to find the precedents and the link around which to convince the institutions of the risks. And so there is some discussion around AI and the ethics of autonomous weapons, but I'm wondering if there's any precedents of universities that have divested from AI weapons anywhere in the world, and B, if there are documents or legal documents. There was Ousman mentioned this recent UNGA effort, but anything that might help us draw a concrete link to more strongly put AI into the controversial weapons category, so we could expand the list of companies we're speaking about when we speak to the university about that.
Ousman, would you like to start?
Yes, look, AI is a buzzword. You know, when you try to put it down into concrete technical terms, it doesn't really make sense. It's basically a media gimmick. You won't be able to properly, you know, in a technical way, say that this is AI and that's not AI. I'll tell you what the Stop Killer Robots. I'll tell you what my position has been on autonomous weapon systems. What generally we've been talking about. So we're looking at systems that select and engage a target with force without a human. Okay. Now, in practical terms, what that is, you've got sensors like thermal sensors, acoustic sensors, visual sensors. They take in data from the external environment, and then you've got a system inside the weapon that processes that data, sorts it out with various algorithms, and converts it into information. And then the system has a predetermined target that it's looking for. So when that information matches the information that is the predetermined target. Sorry, I just got a disconnection for a sec. Oh, so when the information matches the target that is being created previously by the tech person who created the system, it will execute the force. Okay, and that will take place without further human involvement. Okay, so that's what we've been calling an autonomous weapon system. Now, the trick, and which is why, again, civil society is totally complacent and complicit or incompetent, is that it's so easy to subvert this, because we've created this definition that we've been banging on about for the last 10 years. And all you need to subvert that is a single human intervention that takes place after the system is activated. And we say that that's no longer an autonomous weapon system. So these lavender and gospel systems, you have a human that gets all of the information and then gets a recommendation from the system, and they have to press yes to make the kill. But that human operator is somewhere far away from where the actual kill takes place, so they're dislocated, disconnected, and disempowered from the actual force. But Israel is able to say it's not an autonomous weapon system because there's a human pressing a button. I've actually been trying really hard with the civilian agenda to get states to adopt a better definition. And I've said, I've coined this idea of a nominal human input. And I say, look, if the input that takes place after the activation is nominal, i.e. it's mindless, the human is not really engaging with the consequences of the decision, then it's still an autonomous weapon system. But civil society has totally rejected that or not cottoned onto it, even though it is the Palestinian position that they've been advocating for the last 2 years. They've basically ignored Palestine. Why? Because no one gives a shit about them. And they don't have power. They have a very good technical position on this, and they've just been sidelined by civil society, right? So I don't have any faith in the mechanisms of the United Nations to solve this issue. I think the only, and even if you do, what are we solving? It's still, even if you don't use AI, you're still killing people. You still have nightmare bombs that are going to destroy people. The only way we're going to stop killing is if we change the political system that allows this to happen. So I don't have any faith anymore about reports that get put in or working papers or consultations. They're all just ways to make us feel like things are happening when they're not. They can put our effort now into political change.
Andrew?
Just a very quick point to add to that in response to your question. I'm not going to talk specifically about AI because Ousman knows a lot more than I do. But what was really important in the South African BDS campaign, which I cannot emphasize enough how important that was in bringing about an end to apartheid in South Africa. It was obviously a confluence of factors, but boycott, divestment, and sanctions was absolutely crucial. If it wasn't for the BDS movement, South Africa would still be an apartheid state today, because what it did was it ensured, by targeting the banks in particular, and by getting mainly students around the world, and we targeted 2 banks, Barclays Bank in the UK, and what was then Chase Manhattan in the United States. I don't know what it's called today. It's gone through about 38 name changes since then. Because they were 2 of the key members of what was called the Group of 20, who provided loans and foreign exchange to the apartheid regime, and obviously made a lot of money from it. When those 2 banks realized that an entire generation of people, primarily students, were not going to be their customers, they either closed their accounts or they refused to open accounts with them. They divested from South Africa. And that was the point at which our economy started to deteriorate, so that the quality of life of white South Africans started to deteriorate. And that's when the leaders of the apartheid state realized the game was up, when they couldn't maintain the level of luxury that we lived in effectively. And the point I want to make directly in relation to your question is that we didn't bother about precedent. We just went for the most relevant targets. And it didn't matter whether there'd been such campaigns before or not. That wasn't our concern. Our concern was to identify targets that were incredibly relevant to the maintenance of the apartheid system. And I would say adapt that for the situation you're talking about in Edinburgh. If the university has a lot of investments in these sorts of companies, look, we've seen employees in these companies rebel against what the companies are involved in. That should be sufficient for us to target those investments.
Would anybody else like to add anything?
I'll just add that we definitely need to come up in terms of like the future of educational policy. There's very much this sense, like when I was at Manchester, I asked Nancy Rothwell, okay, at what point does our commercial interest come after human life in other countries? And she basically responded being like, well, our government does it, why wouldn't I? and that's on YouTube. But there really is this kind of, again, this delay tactic, this dissonance tactic of just loophole. Okay, so if you like focus it, this is a sense, by the way. I think collectively we need to do more on this, but understanding like, okay, if we just focus on this one thing, then this one system, then there's another system to go around. Obviously at Edinburgh, you're an AI university, right? So it is a stronghold. But in the long term, we need to have something which is more encapsulating of the whole arms industry and how everything under that category is included.
Thank you.
This question is both for Andrew and Ousman. You both mentioned, and also Jinsella as well, needing deep political change for anything to actually realistically get done. And of course, we all like to say revolution, but what do you all think are actual steps that we could be taking right now in order to make this political change?
Before the panel answers, is there another question?
In early April, I think just after the attack on the World Central Kitchen workers in Gaza, 25, I think, civil servants in the Department of Business and Trade said they wanted to cease work immediately on contracts linked to Israel, over fears they could be complicit under the Rome Statute for just obeying superiors' orders. Can you speak to this case? Is there any precedent for individual civil servants being prosecuted for their complicity, and what is the probability of that happening to workers in the Department of Business and Trade?
Yeah, so on EMS, I really like see it as this last like period of the Palestinian genocide has exposed. It's brought everyone close to the truth. Trust is just gone. As Andrew said, this like international governance collapse, this rule of law, and I believe everyone needs to step into their roles as a cog in the machine and, you know, disobediently realign those to our agenda, which is peaceful green societies. So I think there needs to be a inter-organizational, inter-institutional discussion between people, what their skills are, what their roles are, and what our collective agenda is. And I want to see like diversification, and I want to see that work capacity put towards the economic transformation we need. I think, yeah, as like in the university space, as I said, like there's so much work that's done on different political systems, what works, what doesn't work, and really what's missing is the peace agenda.
Also on Em's question, I'm going to leave the second question to you. I'll talk very specifically about the UK at the moment, but this might apply to other places as well. Somebody said, I mean, this is the year of elections. We have elections in so many countries. And I think many of those elections really speak to Barack Obama when he was a candidate, and he was a much better candidate, I think, than he was a president. But he made this great statement about talking about the smallness of our politics by comparison to the gargantuan challenges that our societies face. And sadly, when he became president, he ignored all those gargantuan challenges and played small politics, as most people do. You know, the United States of America is having a rerun of the last election with the two fairly pathetic candidates 4 years older and struggling to string sentences together, both of them. And this is the best, what is supposedly the most powerful nation on the planet can offer to its electorate. In this country, you know, if anyone can tell me any meaningful difference between the Conservatives and Keir Starmer's Labour Party, please, please come and talk to me afterwards, because I'm desperate to find something. I mean, at the moment, Sunak and Starmer seem to be in some sort of a contest about, how much they can increase defense spending by. And where they've got to at the moment, which is 2.5 to 2.5%, and that's an extra 75 billion pounds. And isn't it great that we're in a country that requires no investment in its national health service, no investment in its schools and universities, no investment in our homeless and housing crisis, no investment in actually meaningfully tackling the climate catastrophe? I mean, this is the state of our politics. It's absolutely pathetic. So what can we as ordinary people do about it? Because we can just sit by, we can decide that, yeah, gee, thank goodness we have the right to vote every few years. Let's go and do that for one of the rubbish candidates. And to be honest with you, I feel exactly the same in South Africa. 2 places I can vote, there's no one I want to vote for. But voting is only one part of any sort of political strategy. And I think what we have to do here is, we had a sort of a nascent mass movement developing between 2015 and 2019 that very quickly dissipated. And I think one of the reasons it dissipated was because it didn't have real roots in communities. It was about an individual, and a wonderful individual. But that's not the point. Real movement are about ordinary people standing up for their rights. And I think what we need to do in Britain is we need to build a mass grassroots movement again, but that it's built from the bottom up this time, rather than with a figurehead downwards, where, because if we get to the point, which is incredibly likely, that the people at the dispatch boxes swap places. So we have the man in the very expensive suit, but wearing the red tie. Yeah. And the only reason he'd wear a red tie is because he's an Arsenal supporter, not because he believes in socialism or left politics. And ordinary people who are struggling with daily life realize nothing is changing. That's the point at which we have to build. And what do we build towards? Changing our political system. We have such an antiquated electoral system in this country. It's embarrassing. Westminster's supposed to be the mother of all parliaments. Well, sometimes you have to move on a few generations. And we've got to think about changes to our electoral system. We've got to think about changes to the nature of what I would describe, and I don't want this to sound grandiose, but late neoliberal capitalist democracy. The whole idea of having representative democracy is that there are different parties standing for different things and different interests. Where in the Western world do we have that anymore? Be it on Israel, be it on the climate crisis, be it on the economic difficulties suffered by most people every day of their lives. We don't have a choice. So liberal representative democracy has outlived its usefulness. And I think, and there are people in this room and behind me on the screen, far smarter than me, the time has come for us to start thinking about the entire nature of representative democracy. Do we not have the technological advances whereby we have different systems of organizing ourselves as human beings? Because I think that we're at one of those moments in human history where we know what isn't working. We're not quite sure what could replace it. And we need to do the thinking about that, but we have to also do the organizing that will bring people together to reject the current and to recapture our creativity and our imaginations, which is what neoliberal capitalism has done to us. It's destroyed those intentionally so that we can't create these new ideas. So I think those are the sorts of things that we need to do. And let's see the elections upcoming in all of our various countries as just an opportunity along that road to build momentum and to mobilize people. There we go, make the votes.
There's an organisation called Make the Votes Matter that is trying to change the voting system as we know it. So check them out.
But I experienced a pure PR system in South Africa, and it's as bad as a pure constituency system.
made beyond.
When I took on my own government around the corrupt arms deal, I didn't have a constituency I could go to and say, this is why I'm taking on my government. That could say, okay, well, we're going to continue to support you regardless. So we've got to look, I mean, you know, the different systems aren't the solution. It's about the nature and structure of our politics, and that's what we need to look at. And I think in some ways that's incredibly exciting. But you've got to hit rock bottom to be able to motivate enough people to get excited about doing things differently.
Ousman, would you like to?
Just quickly, I imagine you're running out of time. I just want to say one of the insidious consequences of watching what we've been seeing in Gaza is to make us feel helpless, is to give us a feeling of despair, desperation, and withdrawal. And I'm seeing that in Amman, by the way. And these guys have been through the same shit for, you know, the same amount of time. And we've been doing that in Kashmir. I used to be a Kashmir activist. And at some point I just thought, we're not making any traction. I gave up. And that's how power succeeds, is to make us feel helpless. And I think I just want to talk about my own personal liberation. You know, there's this saying that's going around that it's not just that we will liberate Palestine, but Palestine will liberate us. I feel in the last few weeks more liberated than I've ever felt in my entire life. And it's because I've awakened to a sense of my own power. And it's because I've rejected the fear. And maybe that's what happened to me in New York. I cried so much that I hit that rock bottom. I was like, I can't do this anymore. I can't do, and I was like, I just went and said what I needed to say. And I lost my job, and I don't have a job, and I moved around, and I feel so liberated. And it's the most empowering, beautiful thing in the world. And it's in each of you to realize that, you know, I don't know who said, I think it's probably falsely credited to Nelson Mandela, this saying, that our greatest fear is not that we are inadequate, but that we are powerful beyond measure. I don't know if probably not Mandela, but I think it's true. I don't know, Andrew, correct me if it's not. I think I saw it on a YouTube video, but it's definitely true. Like, we are scared of how powerful we are. We have power, and embrace it. Embrace how powerful you are. Like, do stuff, and you feel great. So there are many things you can do. The BDS, obviously, that's an obvious one. Join the Red Rise for Rafah strike that I'm doing on Friday. Loads of things you can do, and it's so empowering. You find that so many people will collaborate with you to bring down that system. And then what arises from it, we'll see. But the whole system needs to go first. I don't have faith in the electoral system to deliver change. You know, just saw the local elections. Loads of people voted for Labour still. The genocide didn't seem to change their mind. I don't think the general election is going to deliver that kind of result that we need to radically change the way that we're doing things. Then we need to scrap entirely the system, shred it entirely, burn it down, and then from the ashes something better will arise. I don't mean literally burn. Don't burn anything.
Finally, I'd like to hand over to Charlotte to answer the second question.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's such a great question. And just for background, so yeah, in April, the PCS union, which is a civil service union, many of the members said that they would not be doing the kind of actual paperwork of granting these export licenses for arms sales to Israel. And the legal framework under which they grounded their refusal is that actually the Rome Statute is incorporated for all intents and purposes into domestic legislation. And also they are nominally liable under accessory liability. So if you're driving a car and the person in the passenger seat kills someone, you're liable under accessory liability. And that's the same framework under which the PCS union members are liable. It's a completely great argument, and is the same ones under which we wrote those letters to the directors of arms trade companies. They're also liable under accessory liability. Realistically, they're not going to be prosecuted for those offences because it wouldn't cross what's called the prosecutorial threshold.
But it's still so important that people within these organisations are holding their organisations accountable from within. And in terms of, you also asked a question about the precedent of doing this, and there is a precedent of doing this precisely from the PCS union already, who acted as an intervener in the Rwanda litigation and basically spoke about the impact, psychological and otherwise, of being forced to do the immigration-related conduct that they were forced to do. And the last thing that I will say is just, yeah, to really reiterate what everybody else has said on the panel, which is just like, whether it's subverting the political system, whether it's trying to use law from within to kind of do what you can in that limited framework, whether it's like protesting, like we need all of these pieces to work in conjunction. And the thing is, like, while this case seems really, really hard at times, I also like go to parliamentary briefings where I see that it does make a difference. And actually the only information that we're getting is out of this case. And then that feeds into, of course, like, you know, what people are talking about at protests. And we need everybody in the different fields. I think when I was younger, I used to feel really anxious about like what I would do and what my spot would be. And I think in some ways it doesn't matter. You just have to do something. And which of those you pick is just, it's up to you really. So yeah.
So unfortunately, we have run out of time, so I'm really sorry if anybody did have any further questions, but thank you all so much for coming today, and thank you for providing, although highlighting the reality of the situation, especially in the UK with regards to Palestine, but also being so inspirational in sharing what we can do moving forward to ensure the end of the genocide in Gaza, and providing active measures that everyone in the room can take to achieve something very necessary and very, very much so wanted by so many people. So thank you all, and Ousman online, thank you all so much, and thank you ICOP for organising the discussion today. It's really been brilliant. Thank you.